So we continue, or we resume our ruminations. Ready? Okay. Yesterday we were looking at two aspects of our self-enhancement, aspects that seemed somewhat contrary to each other, paradoxical: personal transformation and self-transcendence. Okay? Since that is not often talked about, or these are not familiar categories, I have decided to reflect today also with you, but from a different angle. All right? And I hope that we can walk together along this path of discovery. One of the significant features of the modern age is the emergence of the self-contained, self-accentuating individual. All right? This is Professor Samuel Huntington, who wrote that famous book, rather infamous book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Shaping of the World Order. Now, the self-contained, self-accentuating individual. Now, let me make a reference to another author who may not be very familiar to you, but he is extremely important in the history of thought. A French author, Émile Durkheim, his classic work titled Suicide. If you ever come across this book, you must read it. Suicide, right? And there are 5 major factors that, according to Durkheim, contribute to the spread of the epidemic of suicide, one of which, and this will really surprise you, one of which is unlimited freedom. Unlimited freedom. Now, I want to remind you of an author that I introduced a few weeks ago, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, right? He says that the greatest burden under which the modern man is staggering is meaninglessness. It is not the extent of his suffering. It is not the volume of the challenges he has to face. It is this existential emptiness. I remember reading another book by an author called Harvey Cox, 1964, where he says, particularly commenting on the predicament of young people, he says the youth of today has everything to live with, but nothing to live for. Everything to live with, but nothing to live for. This is a great burden. Pretty much the same thing that Viktor Frankl says. There is no meaning. Social scientists have been telling us for quite a long time now that modern man is afflicted by what they call directionlessness. Directionlessness. All right? We do not know where we are headed. Where are we going? Story is told of Nietzsche after he became a little unhinged, which in itself is an interesting story. When he was around 47, 48, he saw a horse cart driver, flogging the horse. He screamed, ran to the horse, embraced it, and said, "I can understand you, I can understand you." And Nietzsche never recovered. He died insane. Now, I have made some references in the morning, not to overwhelm you with bibliography, but to fix certain markers, to understand our theme a little more clearly, I hope. That's my intention. But as Eliot says, between the intention and the effect falls the shadow. Between the intention and the effect falls the shadow. But there is no place for shadow in St. Stephen's College, right? So intention will also be the effect. If intention is not the effect, then effect is the defect. Right? All right. Okay, now let's come back to this. Now, the self-accentuating individual. The self-accentuating individual emerged by shaking himself free from the web of humanity, which actually held him in balance. There's a very stimulating Jewish thinker called Martin Buber, and his work, I-Thou, used to be the rage of discussion for the first 10 years of its publication. Martin Buber. Martin Buber says that human nature, the human person, needs balance, needs equilibrium, and that cannot be found within himself. He has to have something outside of him in relation to which his equilibrium can be maintained. That is why the concept of the other is so important, right? And this is something that I have alluded to before, so I will not spend much time on this. If you look at the vision of all spiritual traditions, you will find that the human predicament is always understood in terms of interdependence, right? So, in the modern period, interdependence was substituted with independence. That's the first step towards the emergence of the self-contained, self-accentuating individual. Interdependence as an existential principle was rejected. And this was largely on account of the unprecedented affluence that became a reality for the Euro-American cultural bloc, particularly after the Second World War. But when you look at this whole panorama, you come across a very interesting phenomenon. And that is, this grand, much celebrated culture of the self-accentuating individual has not produced any outstanding individual. The outstanding individuals who actually existed right up to, say, 1950, they all said that every individual needs the other. In fact, I quoted Einstein to you a couple of days ago where Einstein says that the value of a human being must be measured in terms of his usefulness to other people. That is no longer the case. Now, this change is to a very substantial degree driven by technology. Now, that is right into the heart of our own predicament today. If you really examine the extent of our dependence on technology, you will discover a huge contradiction. The contradiction is this: the creed of this age, the creed of the culture to which you belong, is the culture of independence. But the real predicament of every individual is abject dependence. There's nothing called a self-contained individual. Yes, you have severed your connections from your fellow human beings. But you have become, as a French philosopher Jacques Ellul says in his very famous television discussion titled The Great Betrayal of the West. The Great Betrayal of the West. It's available to you on the YouTube. I very strongly recommend that to you. And he talks about the dominance of technology over modern individual life as the grand betrayal of the West. Now, if today I say that it's possible for a human being to exist, live without a cell phone, people will think that I'm truly crazy. But I want you to know that I have been experimenting on this. I have not used a cell phone from the 20th of July. I'm still alive. Okay? I want you to test it out for yourself. I find this divorce between me and that gadget such a liberating experience. It has lessened 90% of my burden. It has mitigated my headache. I feel more normal. But who will believe me if I say that it's possible to throw it away? You know, there is a passage in Shakespeare's Macbeth when Lady Macbeth is unwell, and this affects Macbeth a great deal because they were collaborators in a very significant deed, and he thinks he cannot live without her. He pleads with the doctor to cure her, and then the doctor, of course, confesses the limitations of medicines, and then he says in such matters the patient must minister to herself. And Macbeth becomes very angry and he says, throw physic to the dogs. Throw your medicines to the dogs. I'll have none of it. I would like to say, throw cell phone to the dogs. If you do that, the campus will be free from dogs. You try it out. All right? Now, we have become abject slaves to technology in the name of freedom and independence. And the kind of aberration that this dependence on technology has induced in human nature is something that we still haven't come to terms with. All right. Now, let me not go too much into that because that's a subject in itself. I want to bring you back to something very close at heart and very close to nature. Let's understand this idea of personal transformation. And for that, we'll go to nature. I have learned a lot from nature. Nature is my guru. Right? That's why I'm developing a house of leaves there. In about a year's time, you will see a house of leaves. And its name, it will be known as Parnashala. And what Parnashala means? Dr. Mathur will explain to you. All right? He will do a presentation on Parnashala. All right? In whichever tradition of dance. Right? So, I've learned a lot from leaves, a lot from nature. So I'm going to bring you back to nature, right? You think of, and I'm using an illustration from Jesus of Nazareth, who himself learned practically everything or illustrated everything with the help of nature. Jesus says, look at a grain of wheat. A grain of wheat. Now, the grain of wheat has got two options. The first option is to stay alone. Maybe it's a beautiful, grain of wheat, very substantial, jumbo-sized. It's crafted well, and it seems to be, almost bursting with nutrition. There is, when you look closely at it, there is this slight sheen of promise. It's the best grain of wheat you have ever handled. So you say, look, how can I throw this into the mud? I will keep it in a bottle and I will seal it. There's a similar grain of wheat, but this time it's in the hands of a farmer. The farmer says, I'm going to sow this. Right? The farmer lets it go. It falls into the world of mystery. And in due season it springs up. And there is 100-fold harvest. One wheat becomes maybe 100, 200, 300. But the story doesn't end there. From there it begins its pilgrimage. The original grain of wheat. It reaches out to the hungry and mitigates the fire of hunger in the stomachs of men and women. That's a completely different destiny. This grain of wheat, beautiful, no doubt, kept in the container, will remain there for some time, and in course of time it will just disintegrate, and when you touch, it will be the kind of powder which not even ants can eat. Totally useless. There are these two possibilities. There is a story of a pig who went and complained to God, saying, this is not fair. This is absolutely not fair. God says, what? I give everything to people, but nobody appreciates me. They make lard, they cook various dishes with my lard. They eat my meat, my flesh as pork and bacon and ham and all kinds of things. They even pickle my tail. And in spite of this, nobody has a good word to say about me. Whereas they think very highly of the cow. And what does the cow give? Just a little milk and some cow dung. This is not fair. God smiled. Have you seen God smile? Huh? Anyone who has seen God smile? You haven't? It will look like this. All right. Okay. The point I'm making is a very important one. God can smile or cry only through you. That's the point I'm making. Please understand. People think I'm a clown. The media thinks I'm a clown. Only because they don't have the intelligence to understand what I'm doing. You understand? God can smile, God can cry. God does both. Only through you. That is why there is a passage in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, blessed are you when you hunger and thirst for justice. for then you will become the children of God. Children of God express God, right? When your heart burns for justice, when your soul thirsts for justice, God expresses something through you. That's the meaning. All right. So God smiled and then said, you know why? You know why the cow is appreciated and you are not appreciated in spite of all that you give? There's a simple reason for it. Does anyone know what the reason is? Huh? This is why you must listen to God. That is to say, this is why you must attend the assembly. Right? All right. The reason is this. God says, you know, the cow gives all that it gives while it is still alive. You give whatever you give only after your death. You understand? This is the difference. And it's a huge difference. All right? Now, the self-accentuating individual is like the pig. Has no sense of responsibility towards anyone. The self-accentuating individual is like this grain of wheat which is kept sealed up in a bottle. Completely irrelevant to the context. Of no use to anyone. Now, unfortunately, the dominant ideology that this college acquired for a period of time was that of the self-accentuating individual. That's why this college produced certain, individuals who are looked up to in the society. But the college community as a whole got impoverished. We are actually a living parable on the colossal stupidity of modern culture. I mean, there are advantages in the modern culture. I don't want to be completely one-sided, but that's not my theme today. My theme is to highlight a particular aspect from which all of us are suffering. You think of the varied experiences of the grain of wheat as it leaves the hand of the farmer. Who knows what is happening? It's a wonderful thing. You think of the sprout first raising its head above the level of the soil and catching the first glimpse of the morning sun. You think of it. What a beautiful experience it must be. And what a fulfilling experience must be for this ripe, golden grain of wheat that fills the stalk, looking at human beings passing by and saying, look, I am for you. There's a connection between you and me. We all belong together in the grand scheme of things. You and I, what is the difference? I will be you one day, and someday you will be me. All right? So it is this interconnectedness, the web of life, that sustains human greatness. And that is possible only when we learn to transcend, go beyond ourselves. Let's rise for prayer.